For phase 2 of our website project, we are going to take our design that we created in Flash and make it functional to make the buttons, for example, that are across the top here in this navigation bar, functional. Currently the page is laid out in these layers here, where I have a background page like so, that if I view only it by itself, the only thing I see is, well, the background elements. These don't change at all as we're going to continue to work with our website project. So this is just static imagery, text and graphic symbols. Your design will look different. This is my background. On top of that, on a separate layer, and I am activating these layers or only by itself by holding down the Option key or Alt key on a PC and clicking on the layer. That lets me see only the elements that exist on this particular layer and nothing else. So on the menu layer, I have just simple words that allow me to build a navigation that later on we will add buttons to these words to make them active. I have individual pages created, one on each layer on its own layer, that when I activate those guys, I can see on frame 1 my home page, which in my case only exists of the word home, nothing else, that exists on frame 1 and is active through frame 9. and frame 10 a different page comes into existence, the about page, which in my case only contains the word about. On frame 20, on the contact page layer, it only contains the word contact, and on frame 30 the portfolio page comes into existence. So as I drag my playhead over the timeline, one page comes into existence at a time as I move through the timeline. And if I play this movie by pressing Command Return, that is exactly what's happening. So this is my website and it simply cycles through all of the pages. This is my starting point for phase 2. The end result of phase 2 will look like this here. When I play this movie, it does not automatically cycle through all the pages. Instead, I have active navigation across the top that reacts to mouse over events, giving me a visual indication which button I am over. If I press my mouse button down, it gives me an indication of that graphically to make the button area look different. When I let go of my mouse right now, it takes me to the contact page. If I click on About, it takes me to the About page, and likewise for the portfolio page. So I can navigate back and forth between the different pages. And that is the end result of phase 2, and that is what we're going to work through in this video here. So let's get started. And the first thing I want to do is take a look at the description of the phase 2 requirements. So we are to make the navigation functional. We're going to create a new layer that will contain our navigation buttons, and we are going to create a generic button symbol. So let's do that first. I'm going to switch back to Flash here and back to my starting point. So here I want to create a new layer above the background but below the menu layer that will contain my buttons. I click create a button or a layer, name it. This is my navigation buttons layer. And on here I want to create buttons that allow me to implement the navigation later on. So in order to create a button, I want to create a generic button symbol first that defines the shape and the different mouse over and button down states. In order to create this generic button, I'm going to insert and create a new symbol. This will be my nav button symbol, and I make sure that the type is set to be a button. So here we are. We are creating and editing a brand new symbol. The center plus sign tells us where the center portion of our symbol will be. So I have different states. First thing I want to create is the over state. For up means we are nowhere near our button with our mouse, so I don't want it to have anything showing. For over, I'm going to create a keyframe for the over state, and then I'm using my rectangle tool. I make sure that I'm in object drawing mode, and I create a skinny little box like so to define my over state. It has a fill color, and this will be what my button will look like when I move my mouse over the active area. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a keyframe in the down frame. So insert keyframe, and then I'm going to change the appearance of this button here. I do this by selecting my free transform tool, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see what's going on here better. I want to move my white dot here to one of the edges. This will be my center point that any manipulations I create will be centered around that point. So using my free transform tool, I drag down the shape to make it tall, and this will be my down state when I press my mouse button down. The third state that you have to define for this generic button symbol is the hit state, which defines the active area of the button. In this case, I'm going to insert a keyframe, and I leave the rectangle to be exactly the same as it is. So my hit area, the area that the button will come to life, if you will be exactly the same shape as my down button, rectangle shape. The over is the skinny one, down, and the hit area is my active area of the button that will bring the button to life if I move my mouse over it. So this defines my symbol. It exists in my library now, nav button symbol. Next, I will add this button to my stage in frame 1 here. So I'm taking my nav button symbol and I'm dragging it to the stage like so. The blue area that you see defines the active area, the hit area, so to say. And I can, oops, back up one here. I want to position it so that it's right over, well, let me try this one more time. In order to position the button, I need to lock my menu layer, otherwise I will always select the word that's on top of this shape. So I'm locking my menu layer that contains just the words, and then I can select my button instance and move it so that it covers the area that says home. This needs to get a name, and I'm going to start all my instance name with a lowercase I, and then I'm calling it home button. This is the name that we'll have to refer to later on in our action script when we want to talk to this button or take action when this button is pressed. So this is my home button. Next, I'm going to create another button. I drag this over my about word and give it a name of I about button. And I do the same thing for the other two. For the contact button, I can drag this over here, and I need to modify it slightly. I need to change the appearance of this button because it's not quite wide enough to actually cover the whole word. So I'm going to use my free transform tool, and I move this center button over here, and I extend my button shape out this way. This is only changing this particular instance of the button, not the underlying shape. I'm simply stretching the button symbol, or this instance of the button symbol. I name it I contact button, and last but not least, I'm creating a button for portfolio, and I need to do the same thing. Stretch it slightly so that it fits over the word that I want to be activating the button, and this is named I portfolio button. So now I have 4 button shapes defined. Each one of them has an instance name that corresponds to the menu navigation item that it belongs to. So it starts with an I, indicating in the name that it is an instance as opposed to the name of the symbol itself. Alrighty. At this point, these buttons should actually functional in the sense that they will interact with me when I play this movie. And it's still scrolling through the entire timeline. That's okay. But when I move my mouse over the home button, I can see that these buttons are actually coming to life the moment I enter this active area. When I click the mouse button down, they extend, giving me a visual clue that I pressed the button. So this is actually working as of right now. But what I have to do next is tie this to some actual action to make the navigation functional and to jump to a specific page. So let's work on that. In order to create any action scripts, or as a preparatory step, I'm going to create a layer that I need to call actions with a capital A. So this is important that you call it exactly that. This is where all of our actions will reside. In fact, all of our actions will reside in frame 1 of this layer here. So I open up the actions panel by right-clicking on this frame, and I'm scrolling out of the window, but at the very bottom there's a choice called actions that will bring up this window here. And here I can type in action script to perform certain actions and to take actions if something happens, or I can listen to button clicks. The first thing I want to try out here is a simple command called stop with opening and closing parentheses and a semicolon. When that gets executed, it simply stops the timeline from stepping through all the different frames. So since this happens on frame 1, my movie right now should stop on frame 1 and not move through the rest of the timeline anymore. So I'm going to try this out, Command Enter, and indeed my timeline no longer circles or cycles through my entire 40 frame timeline. My buttons are still active, which is a good thing, but it's no longer cycling. Alright, so for our next step, I want to add some action script that actually starts listening for button presses for the home button, for example. So I open up my actions panel again, and the way you listen for button clicks is this program here, and I'm going to copy a line from my other program. I pasted one line of code from one of my other programs into here, and this will implement or will add a function that starts listening for button clicks. The starting point of this line here is the I home button, which is the instance name of our button if I select this button here, it has the instance name of iHome button. That is what I need to talk to. And the next element here is I'm adding an event listener. Now these words are case sensitive. You have to type them exactly the way they are, otherwise they will not work. This is a standard term. This never changes in our program here. Inside the opening parentheses, the first element is a mouse event dot click. You have to write it exactly like this, and that makes the button listen to mouse clicks from the user. This is what we want to do when somebody actually clicks on our button, and this is the name of a function that will get executed when somebody clicks on the button. So I'm going to write this function next. I'm pasting this function from something I had already written. So this name here is the name of my function, and it has to perfectly match the name that you're specifying here. The first line is kind of standard. Write it exactly like this. The only thing you want to change is the name of the function, and it must match the name that you list in the event listener. Inside here, what I'm going to do actually is change this from home to simply have a number inside here. By default, when you have a function go to and stop, that tells Flash to, well, go to and stop at the frame 1. So this will take us, when I click on the home button, take us to frame 1. Now I need to actually add something else to it because I'm already on frame 1 when I start the movie, so this won't do a whole lot. I won't be able to see the difference. I'm going to create an event listener by copying and pasting this entire block of code, and instead of iHome button, I'm going to create something for my About button, which has the instance name of iAbout button. So I change this to iAbout. And here jump to About, which happens to begin on frame 10. So I want to jump to frame 10, go to and stop there. So I have two buttons that should be active now, About and Home. I should be able to jump back and forth between those two frames. Let's try this out. Duplicate function defined. I get an error message here, so that did not work. I must have missed a step here. And of course what I did here is I forgot to rename this function to match my function name here. So this needs to say About. And let's run this again. So now I don't get any error messages in my output panel here. And I kind of lost my spot here. Let's run this again. So if I click on the home button, nothing happens because I'm already on frame 1. If I click on About, it should take me to the About page. So this is a big step in the right direction. I can jump back and forth between About and Home. So what I need to do next is to do what I've already done for Home and About for the other two buttons, Contact and Portfolio. And I'm just going to do this offline real quick. I've paused the movie momentarily while I was typing this in. So what I've done here, and this is what I had earlier, I had functions for my home button. This adds the listener, and this is the function that actually makes it work. The name has to match. Same thing for About. And I've added a listener for Contact button. It jumps to Contact, and actually I need to update these here. So the function name has to match. Whatever I'm listing back here, this is the name of the function that I have to define. And inside this function, I go, in this case, to frame number 20, and in the case of the portfolio button, which has the function name of jump to portfolio, which I have to update here, portfolio, and this will jump to frame 30 and stop there. So now this should actually implement my whole navigation piece. If I play this movie, I can jump to the About page, I can jump to Contact, Portfolio, and wherever I want to, I can jump back and forth. So this is essentially the functionality that I'm looking for in phase 2. I'm going to make one more modification, and that is these frame numbers. They may get a little bit hard to manage down the road, so I'm going to make one modification to my project here so that I can refer to these frames by name. I can do this by jumping to a particular frame. For example, well, the first frame here. If I look at my properties panel for this frame, there is a name field that I can assign to this frame, and I'm going to call it home, lowercase, and this will be the label that I assign to this frame here. When I hit enter, it should then show me that this frame has been named home. I can do the same thing for the subsequent frames. So this here is my about, and I need to insert a frame, or a keyframe in this case, so that I can define a new label, and this is my home, not home, rather about. So I'm assigning labels to these frames by inserting a keyframe and then assigning a label. And this is my contact frame, and the last one, insert keyframe. I name this here my portfolio. So this simply gives names to these frames so that when I use or when I refer to the frames inside my action script, instead of calling it frame 1, I can call it home. Jump to, go to, and stop at the frame with the label home, and so forth. I can refer to my frames by their label names, which makes the code much more readable, because it's not obvious what frame 20 actually holds. But if I refer to it by name, like contact, I can make much more readable code. That works the same way as before. I'm just replacing the frame number with the label that I assigned to this particular frame. Let's try this out. And my code should still work, jumping between the different pages, except now it is using labels instead of frame numbers. And this pretty much wraps up, I believe, our phase 2 of the project. I added a generic button symbol, had the up over hit states defined, added 4 instances of this generic button, and I used ActionScript to keep it from loading when I initially load it, and then I added ActionScript to listen for button clicks and advance the timeline to that appropriately labeled frame. So this is the complete phase 2 project. And one more time real quick, playing this allows me to navigate from one page to the next, and I have animated buttons that define different mouse over and mouse down states, and they have an active area. So this is it for phase 2, and I'll see you in the next movie where we will work on phase 3.